Forgotten Realms is by far the most popular D&D setting. Its world of Abier Toril is vast, containing many lands across several continents. However, it suffers from just about every world-changing event happening on the Sword Coast. What about the other lands? Greetings, travellers. I am Shoot Come, the Chimney Summoning Wizard, and welcome to the 5th episode of my series on the Lost Worlds of D&D. Today, I'll be dipping into subsettings again. Multiple this time. Each of these subsettings is derivative of Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms began as a fantasy world designed by Canadian writer Ed Greenwood and adapted as a D&D world for the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. To understand how in-depth Greenwood's notes on the setting are, there is a legend that he was asked for the cliff notes on the Red Wizards of Theater convention. He stated he could not provide them as they were in his basement, handwritten on both sides of an A4 ream of paper. If that was just the cliff notes, what is his usual level of detail on any given subject on the Forgotten Realms setting? But I digress. Most of Greenwood's writing focuses on Faerun, the cognate of Europe, and the Sword Coast in particular. However, the Sword Coast is but only part of that world. Many box sets for other areas were delegated to writers and game designers at TSR, and later Wizards of the Coast. If Faerun is Toril's Europe, Kara-Tur is Toril's Asia. Unfortunately, the initial kingdoms from the AD&D Kara-Tur sourcebook are rather uninspired, consisting of Imperial China, Warring States China, Imperial Japan, Warring States Japan, Tibet, and Korea. Other areas are mentioned, such as Siberia, Indochina, and Inner Mongolia. The subsetting was picked up for 3rd edition, and Malatra and the Fire Isles were given more substance. Another Japan cognate called Rokugan was thrown into the mix as the default starting area of Kara-Tur, even though it was supposed to be a standalone setting for the revitalized Oriental Adventures line. If the name Rokugan sounds familiar to players of Legends of the Five Rings, it should. More on that later. For now, let's look at the plane of horses, specifically the fact that some errant Mongols were isekai'd from Earth and... Let's just say that the rise of the Hordes in the Hordelands caused some in-universe controversy. With trade routes eastward disrupted by hordes of definitely Mongols, the richest merchants on the Sword Coast found their wealth in peril. "Wait," said a merchant prince probably smoking crack. "If Toril is round, why don't we go this way to get to Kara-Tur?" As mentioned in the episode on the Council of Worms, Maztica is a large continent to the west of Faerun, and cognate of the Americas. My familiarity with this setting is mostly through the tie-in novels of all things, and the plot of those mostly mirror early conquistadors until the local gods get more involved in blood sacrifice. The conquistadors even have harquebusiers in their ranks, who sort of vanish after the first book. I wonder if the bizarre misinterpretation of Greenwood's Faerun is just on the verge of developing powder weapons directive as there can be no guns had anything to do with that. Anyway, Maztica features dogmen, green people, halflings who are not halflings but actually pygmies and not pygmies and actually halflings, and dwarves who live in the desert and don't use metal. This is because their ancestors travelled through the Underdark and sealed the sub-oceanic tunnels behind them to kill the drow that dared follow them. If the errant German used for place names in Icewind Dale didn't give every linguist an aneurysm, just know that the local feather-based magic in Maztica is called Pluma, by the locals, whose language is not based on Latin. Interestingly, the 2nd edition Pluma Weaver kit is available to characters of the Rogue class group, provided they are Maztican and lawful good. Honestly, I'm not all that familiar with this setting mechanically, and it ties very closely with historical Mesoamerica. So let's head back east, shall we? Peace be upon you, my brethren. Do you like my desert attire?
But Shoot Come, you're not from the Middle East. Wearing that is cultural appropriation.
Presuming offence for someone else unprompted, are we, strawman? What are you, an Englishman? Mukabid al-abwab fi manzilik musnait min al-kulfati. Al-Qadim began as a setting book for AD&D 2nd edition and is one of the most fondly remembered subsettings for Forgotten Realms. It is set on the continent of Zakhara, which is a cognate of the Middle East, albeit thematically close to the 1001 Arabian Nights in any historical period of that region. That being said, there are plenty of historical references tucked away in the setting. Al-Qadim introduces desert survival rules, where a character who doesn't get enough water or spends time in full sun wearing metal armor suffers from fatigue. While a small battle might only last a few minutes at the most, an armored fighter could take weeks to recover from the ordeal, if it doesn't kill him outright, of course. One thing that sets Al-Qadim apart from your standard fantasy milieu is the emphasis on the local ethics and honor system. For example, a Zakharan thief who steals a gem from a vault in a sultan's palace may walk free if he manages to defend himself before the law by stating that the sultan would not have gone through such rigorous security methods if he did not wish to challenge thieves across the land to take it. However, if he consumed salt within the palace, he was a guest, and that defense would be discarded. As another example, if a thief manages to abscond with loot stolen from the nomadic Al-Badiya people, they will laud his bravery and allow him to keep his gains. Unless it was water. Then the punishment is death. Of course, originating from 2nd edition, this setting makes good use of kits and ties the honor system to them. The two standout kits I'll be talking about are based on historical equivalents. The first is the Holy Slayer kit. This is based on the historical Ismaili, or Order of Assassins. Despite having a set of restrictions to make the Paladin's ethos look lenient, this kit is extremely popular with Al-Qadim thief players. The second kit is the Mamluk. Much like their historical equivalent, Mamluks were sold into slavery as children and raised as soldiers. Yes, slavery is not only prevalent in Zakhara, but is usually a state-run venture. Any warrior with this kit is beholden to a military chain of command from which he cannot break free. If you know your history, you know precisely why this is a most excellent and flawless idea. Arcane magic is reworked for Al-Qadim. Instead of the schools of magic, wizards choose from 4 elements. There we go. There is a 5th element which all wizards may choose from, as this covers all the necessary generic wizard spells not covered by the elements. While the selection of these elements hinges on what kit the wizard has, there is an exception. While presented as a kit, the Sha'ir is essentially a new wizard class. Instead of using a spellbook and memorizing spells, the Sha'ir relies on a bound Jan of one of the elements. The other ones this time. When a Sha'ir wishes to cast a spell, he sends out his Jan to fetch the spell. The higher the level of the spell, the longer it takes the Jan to return with it, and the higher the rate of failure. Jan may even be sent out to fetch divine spells, but it will take twice as long, and the wizard will anger the gods if his Jan fails. This can result in anything from minor divine retribution to planar travel to face justice. Of course, the Jan is no slave either, and will abandon the Sha'ir if mistreated, and likely return with one of his genie big brothers in tow. Due to the nature of the Sha'ir not actually needing to memorize arcane spells or have spellbooks, even dwarves may become one. Observe this full map of Toril. As you can see, there is an equivalent of Australia here. This land is called Aussie and is officially not an Australian cognate. Nothing has been done with it except for Wizards of the Coast deciding it's not going to be a cognate of Australia if they do anything with it. Instead, I'm sure Aussie will simply be a mostly desert continent where the native population fights local megafauna for arable land using boomerangs and fire, and the word cunt is so ubiquitous that the worst thing you can call someone is a dog. Remember me mentioning a Rokugan? As it turns out, Alderak Entertainment Group managed to catch Hasbro Alloy's wanking and through some legal fidgy-widginess managed to use their own setting for the rebooted Oriental Adventures line and keep hold of it for the L5R card game and eventually the L5R role-playing game. Partly due to the confusion about Rokugan being part of the setting or not, concise maps of Karatur have not been printed in years. Despite this, the human Karatur ethnic group of Shan are always mentioned as being common in Forgotten Realms books. The borders and interior of the Hordelands were never clearly defined, so we're shit out of luck with them too. As for the other realms, Maztica has not been touched since TSR went bankrupt, Aussie will probably never be touched, and Al-Qadim? Well, let's just say that the events of the 11th of September 2001 certainly put a dampener on any enthusiasm for advertising the setting, despite its popularity with players. Besides, we've all noticed the pattern of what happens when Yankees of the Coast try and depict any culture outside the norm for big American cities, haven't we? I don't think it matters who is at the helm of D&D or Forgotten Realms products. They will beat the Sword Coast like the dead horse that it is, and every other region of Abia Toril will be neglected into obscurity. Do give the box sets and setting books for these subsettings a chance, though. They do much to dispel the idea that the Sword Coast is the centre of the world. The script for this episode didn't reach my own standards, so fuck it, let's keep going. Now I've covered some lesser-known parts of 5th edition's baked-in setting, I'm going to cover 4th edition's less deliberately baked-in setting. The world is called Narath, and the setting is called Nentir Vale, Points of Light. This abortion of a setting had the misfortune of being part of D&D 4th edition, a world which began in the pages of the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide as a mere example of world building, but quickly expanded into a full-fledged setting. It even had a Risk-esque board game. But I'll leave that outside the scope of this video. Before history was recorded, Nentir Vale did not exist. It was a large forest inhabited by treant druids who tended to the sacred ash tree called Malorunth. Eventually, dragons arrived and showed their dominance by destroying Malorunth with fire. This sparked the War of Endless Branches, which destroyed most of the forest. The land that had been cleared came to be known as Nentir Vale. Between this time and an age of empires, a city-state obsessed with necromancy called Andok Sur was established, and swallowed by an earthquake. Two empires would turn Nentir Vale into a battlefield. A dragonborn empire called Archosia and a human empire called Baal Turath just so happened to have their borders meet there. Eventually, both these empires collapsed. First Archosia due to warriors' honor, and then Baal Turath when they were cursed by Asmodeus and turned into tieflings for exploiting Archosian warriors' honor. Due to generations of constant skirmishes and battles, the Vale was sparsely populated by humans, elves, dwarves, and various humanoids. At some point, the Narathi Empire moved north and colonized the Vale. Nentir Vale was part of the Narathi Empire for around 200 years until orcs and demons ripped the Narathi Empire to pieces. Nentir Vale was largely untouched for the better part of a century until orcs invaded. Aside from a few fortified settlements, Nentir Vale is mostly burned-out countryside full of monsters. Those settlements act as points of light in the darkness. As it is baked into the setting, and the setting is baked into the system, 4th edition abandoned the Great Wheel cosmology in favor of the World Axis. Not entirely abandoned, of course. Look at that. This is also the first time the Feywild and Shadowfell entered D&D cosmology. The Feywild is a realm of life and wilderness, while the Shadowfell is one of darkness and undeath. There's not really much to say about this, except that the material plane is the center of all things, and it lacks much of the nuance of the old cosmology as shown by the Planescape setting. It should be noted that alignment returned to the single axis of basic D&D at this time, in a manner of speaking. Instead of the alignments being lawful, neutral, and chaotic, these alignments were bookended with lawful good and chaotic evil, essentially defeating the purpose of both previous iterations of alignment. Thank Bahamut they abandoned it for 5th edition. I was first introduced to tieflings via the Planescape setting, so in my mind every tiefling should be unique, prone to various forms of magic and mania, and inherently mysterious. Standardizing them for 4th edition was a fucking mistake. All the mystery surrounding tieflings has dissipated in 4th and 5th editions as a result. Also, look at this design and tell me that's not a Draenei from World of Warcraft. As for Dragonborn, I just don't like them very much. Thematically, Nentir Vale hits many notes for a dark fantasy setting, but due to the sheer superheroic power levels of 4th edition characters, those themes fall into the background as player characters stomp through the setting like shonen anime protagonists who just remembered the power of friendship. Nentir Vale tried far too hard to be a standout setting, but ended up as another forgettable fantasy kitchen sink. It pushed Points of Light as its defining theme, and while that theme has persisted in other works since, Nentir Vale is largely forgotten because it is forgettable. Shit. It's shit. 4th edition, I mean. D&D 4th edition is shit is what I'm trying to say. Honestly, I'd forgotten Nentir Vale even existed until I was reminded of it. However, many fans of 4th edition won't hear a bad word about it. Until we next meet, fare thee well.